Hello and welcome to the Roundtable with me, David Foster, part 2 of our special look at homelessness, not just in the UK, but beyond. In this city alone, London, one of the leading cities of the world, 170,000 people, it is thought, are homeless. We've talked about some of the reasons for it in part 1 of this special study on homelessness. We've got some of the same guests that we had in part 1. Let's just give you a little taste, a reminder of some of the points they had to make.
As a result of the impact of welfare changes and cuts to public services, that impact being rolled out into communities. People that used to be able to access mental health can't access it anymore, so they can't then manage their affairs appropriately. People who are being driven into food banks. I mean, in the 6th richest country in the world, we've got people having to queue up for food from charities and donations, and we tell us we're one of the greatest countries in the world. We're not.
I think there's also a longer term problem, is we haven't built enough homes for the last 40 years, and that's not a party political point. It's under Labour and Conservative government.
What I've been hearing a lot is this really worrying catch-22 of trying to access mental health services and being told we're not going to do that until you deal with your drug and alcohol dependency, and then trying to access those kind of services and being told we're not going to deal with that until you deal with your underlying mental health issues. So you're just caught absolutely in the middle.
And I'm very pleased to say that at the round table we still have Maeve McClenaghan from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I'll just get Maeve in a moment to remind us of what she found out. We have Saima Ahmed, the shelter coordinator in London, and Patrick Mulrenan from London Metropolitan University. He's the housing professor there. And at the end of the last programme, we were joined from Leicestershire in the UK by Louise Winterburn from World Habitat, leading the European End Street Homelessness Campaign, and she was talking to us particularly, Louise, you were, about the Finland project, the Y Foundation. You said it is being rolled out in a number of cities, towns in the United Kingdom, in England and in Scotland. How are they doing it?
So in Scotland, Turning Point Scotland about 10 years ago started looking at how it could develop its own Housing First programme. And they again were able to show that this really worked for a group of people that up till then had been failed in terms of sustaining tenancies. So again, they were providing homes, long-term and wraparound services that people needed. Since then, they've been able to use that evidence, and it's really grown in Scotland. What's really exciting about looking at Scotland is the Scottish Government last year made a commitment to end homelessness, and it really said that it saw things like Housing First, along with other sorts of ways of working, were a really important way that they thought they could start to end homelessness in Scotland. So a really exciting development there. So what we've got going on in Scotland is a Housing First Scotland programme, where 5 cities, it's about £3 million, are starting to look at how do they make this change from traditional housing and homelessness services to ones that actually also incorporate Housing First. So they're just about to start that process. That's really exciting. It's in 5 cities that actually then will share their learning quite quickly with the rest of the country.
Okay, so how does it work?
So what they're doing is they first of all need to really understand homelessness and what's happening in each of those cities. They're bringing together people that sometimes have worked very well, organisations, local authorities, the NHS, to say, how do we need to work differently? So which bit is working well that we're going to keep, and which bits are not working for people? Why are there still rough sleepers out on our streets? And they're coming up with local plans. And one of the big things that always comes up is, well, we need access to more housing. If we're going down a Housing First route, where do we find these affordable, secure housing? And they're going to be doing that in a variety of ways. There isn't, even £3 million isn't a simple answer when you're looking at affordable housing, but it is a really important starting place.
I should say, and we'll bring it back to the studio, be back with you in a minute, Louise. For those watching this in different countries, National Health Service is the NHS. That is the one that we all pay for and is supposedly free at the point of delivery from birth to death, supposedly. We will ask about that. Are you excited by what you're hearing?
Any initiative that addresses homelessness is an exciting initiative, and we have a lot to learn from the way that other countries approach homelessness. I think you have to be open about that. In a way we learn the best practice that other countries pursue. So yeah, any initiative is exciting.
And what about well, you discovered that between October, I think it was, last year and January, February of this year, 100 extra people, in addition to the 449 that you had already reported on, had died on the streets of Britain. Is it your belief, there's no definitive proof on this one, is it your belief that were a scheme like this in place, those people who you identified by names, it was an extraordinary piece of journalism because there were pictures as well, there were their life stories, that many of them would be alive today?
I think it could be a really important intervention. I mean, the fact that people are dying physically on the streets or in hospitals or in hostels, you know, all of that would go away overnight if they were in this housing first model and services knew where they were and could be working with them, because that's often the issue, is people kind of dropping through the gaps of the provision that exists. In some cases, you know, there were people that died whose bodies were found in tents, decomposed to the state that they needed dental records or DNA records to identify them. When people are dying like that, you know, in 21st century Britain, something is going wrong.
Almost within plain sight.
Yeah, you know, hidden away behind a hedgerow next to a path where people are walking by every day. But for whatever reason, services are not engaging with them. And yeah, I think it can only help if those people are inside with a roof over their head with the wraparound services that Louise has been talking about.
You talked about lessons that have been learned through the work that you and others have done on the deaths of homeless people.
Yeah.
Give me a bit more on that.
I think almost one of the most shocking things off the project we did at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism was that nobody else was doing that count. You know, I spent a couple of weeks back in early 2018 ringing around coroners' offices, hospitals, police forces, and everybody said, oh, we don't count how many people are dying homeless, but somebody else will. And it took a couple of weeks of doing that to realise that actually nobody was. Another thing we looked into is when a homeless person dies, there is a mechanism by which people can learn lessons for what happened, which is called a safeguarding adult review, which councils would do if a vulnerable child died or an elderly person died, to see, you know, were the services working with them, what the kind of access points they had to those were. But we found out that those just simply weren't happening for
And am I right
people.
in saying that a government body, if not the government itself, but a government body, I think it's the Office for National Statistics, has now taken up the work that you're doing because they believed it was so important?
Yeah, that's right. So we opened up our database to the Office for National Statistics, and they used that to develop a methodology. And then in December just gone, they produced for the first time their own official figures on homeless deaths, which showed a huge increase, 24% in 5 years of people dying homeless.
Let's talk about those who fall between the cracks. Let's talk a little bit more about the shelter that you run. It happens to be in a mosque. What is the turnaround of different people? You have, what, 12 to 14 there at any one time?
We have
Are they always the same people?
15 guests that we have. The turnaround last year, we moved on 60 into permanent housing and they still continue to use the day centre for support. This year, the numbers have dropped.
60 out of how many?
60 out of 80, actually.
So 20 didn't get
this
help.
And
Do you know what's happened to them, or have they just
They are still
disappeared?
working with the day centres to find out how to move on to permanent housing.
So these people haven't disappeared?
No, they haven't disappeared, and they still access the day centre services day in, day out, and work with their key workers to move on.
Going back to the original point that was raised a little bit earlier and addressing your point as well, is the one about stigma, is the stigma that comes with being homeless.
Yeah.
And I think that explains partly what you were saying about people being found behind hedges, hidden away. There's a whole stigma, and it's not just people sleeping on the street. In our research, we found out that, of students, we found out that none of them had actually approached the university services for help, and none of them had talked to their friends, and most of them had not talked to their families about being homeless. And given the fact there's so many people are homeless, it's interesting that people feel some shame in it, and it's wrong to feel shame in it.
But I'm going to bring up a particular case that I read about in researching for this programme, but it's interesting that, yes, there is shame felt, but there's also an element of self-protection in this one. I don't know whether you've read about it. There was a local councillor in Wales, in Cardiff, who said, let's get these tents off the street. And she was vilified for what she said. But a number of homeless people said, actually, we don't want to move into hostels because we think that we are in more danger there from drug abuse and from falling in with the wrong crowd. So we've got a wrong approach in that area as well, haven't we?
Yeah. I mean, the obvious thing there is to make hostels safer rather than clearing
But
people.
why are they perhaps places of danger?
Because they're trying to pack in as many people as possible into these spaces without the right individuals looking after those hostels either. They're trying to, and I would agree with a lot of those guests as well. I would never want to be in a room full of about 100 people that you don't even know. That's safeguarding yourself as well as the volunteers around you. It's quite a difficult thing to do. And also in London, it is very easy to be homeless actually, because there is always food provisions out there. There's soup kitchens left, right and centre in London. There's day centres that are where you can have showers. So students in your university, I can see how they go through terms without even telling anyone that they are homeless, because there's so much provision out there that you can kind of get away with it.
Louise, other than instituting the kind of programmes that you've seen and which you believe to be accessible, is there something else that needs to be done immediately to perhaps set the foundations for a better system in this country?
I think there are several things. I mean, I would like just to pick up on one point there from that conversation, and I think you know, Maeve mentioned it and Saima mentioned it and Patrick as well, about, you know, these are people who are homeless. They know what they need, they know what they've tried before, and they know what hasn't worked. And so one of the cool things we do on our campaign, and has been mentioned there, is that we go out and talk to people. So not just counting heads, but actually spending time with people. Hundreds of volunteers from local communities going out saying, we want to make a difference in our community, sitting with someone who's homeless and saying, tell me. You know, we have very structured forms, but at the same time, it's actually about understanding who that person is and what they actually need. And I think any government policy, any work that any NGO or other communities do, has to come from that starting point of what's happening locally and what do homeless people actually
I know they
need.
are all individuals and therefore each story is going to be different, but are there common themes running through what you hear?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the things we've talked about, and I think, you know, it was amazing, you know, to hear Maeve talking about the work that she's done, is actually one of the big problems we have is that we don't know, that there aren't, you know, across Europe, but even across the UK, if you start looking at statistics, we don't fully know the size of the problem. We don't fully know what's happening in certain places. We're not projecting what issues are coming up and how we're actually going to deal with them. So there is a really big issue around data and actually understanding what works and what doesn't work, so that we can make sure that we're doing the right thing.
So is that common to all of Europe, the fact that nobody really knows?
Yeah, it's a massive issue. There's lots of, you know, people don't even directly count. We don't have full agreements on what do we mean by homelessness. So in different countries, they'll have different ideas about what you have, you know, what your circumstances are to mean that you're actually homeless. So it's very different to try and compare it across countries, really. I mean, the other thing I would say in terms of what's missing is that absolute belief, and it's been expressed here by everyone, I think, is that you know, street homelessness and homelessness itself is wrong, and that actually we can do something about it. You know, there are countries that are showing us that it can happen. There are communities that are showing us that they can make this change, and that fundamental commitment to that from policy, from businesses, from communities, that we can change this.
Just a quick thought, we will come back to you, but just a quick thought. How much more do you think it costs the Finland taxpayer to fund for this admirable project, so that we can put that into context about how difficult it would be politically for a party to sell this idea?
Well, I don't have any of those figures on me, but what I can tell you is that over time it's cheaper. It's much, much cheaper to house people in accommodation, provide the services, and it works. Now, in terms of if you were to come back to this and we could look at some of the cities where they're doing this, there's actually quite a lot of research where they will actually try and work out, based on the current homeless population, based on all of those services. So the emergency services that you've talked about in terms of Selma and communities actually themselves providing provision, because there's massive gaps, all the efforts and money that they're putting in, all the way up to the police, the National Health Service, probation, crime, you know, all of that money being spent because we're not doing it the right way, as opposed to how much it actually costs to provide housing and those services where we know where people are.
What about this one? And I'll put this one to you, Patrick. Anybody can come in on it. There is an element of you have to provide affordable housing if you are a developer, but it's a very small element.
Yes.
What if it was, if you want to make 10 million out of this particular project, you have to provide 50% of it as affordable housing. In other words, local authority housing or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
that would be available. Would that be enough, or would a first step?
It's a step. I know what the developers would say,
Well,
which
of course
is...
they would say, well, look, you know, we're not going to build the houses,
Yeah.
but that's their business. They
That
are
is.
going to build the houses.
It is, but I think the way to look at it is not constantly trying to lever in a little bit of money here and where people are developing, having a few there. It's really putting some investment in, and it really is an investment. It will pay back if we do it. Over 40 years, you will pay back your investment. So it's actually putting money in at the start and not kind of... It's fine to get developers to do that, but it's a relatively small-scale approach to the problem.
Okay, so
You actually did an investigation into that, in fact, because there are those kind of percentages in contract.
I just made that one up, but
It's not 50%, but it's something. But what
think it's
happens?
10%,
It's something, and then the contracts get signed, and then once they're signed, the developer goes to the council and says, "Look, we've reassessed. It's too expensive. So either we wash our hands and walk away, or
and do you know what
reduce
happens
it."
then? Because this has happened where I live, is that the developer then says, I tell you what I'll do, I'll give you £100,000 for you to build a playground for the children instead, and we'll just let that one, they say thank you very much, because they're happy to have £100,000.
Yeah.
But here's another point. We are a small island with an awful lot of people on it. Even if in the United Kingdom we build 3 million houses a year for the next 10 years, is that going to solve the problem?
Well,
More and more people are coming in, perhaps.
Well, they've quantified it and done a lot of research into it, and it's about 300,000 a year is a generally accepted figure.
300,000, sorry, I said 3 million, I meant 300,000.
No, that's fine. 3 million would be fantastic.
Yeah.
But 300,000 would be adequate.
You wouldn't be able to sleep at night for the building noise.
But certainly 300,000 would do it, and it's not beyond the government to do that. We've done it, not since the 1970s, but we have done that before. So it is a matter of political will and what choices you make.
And we made the point in the previous programme that there are buildings sitting empty all across the UK, you know, whole swathes of London where there's empty buildings. So it's not for a lack of properties, it's just who owns and controls those properties, and whether housing benefits which have been frozen for a period are not keeping up with private rent. So people that are on housing benefits just cannot find anywhere that they can rent on that amount.
Your work must be a bit depressing, but it must also be extraordinary to look into this and think that you're bringing it to the attention of so many people.
Yeah, it's gratifying to do, but it's traumatic to read day in, day out stories of people that could be my friends, could be me, could be my mother, could be my father. You know, in our database, there's stories like a guy who at one point almost had a research position with Stephen Hawking. He was a very clever physicist, ended up living in his car and dying in a hotel. A woman who, mother to 4 kids, loving mother, ended up dying in a doorway. Reading these stories day in, day out is, it's so...
Well, intellect is no guarantee of not falling into the poverty trap. And you must see that. I mean, some of the people you meet at the night shelter.
I see it.
Extraordinary. You must just think, how? Why?
Yep, I see it day in, day out. Last year we had some ex-Sudanese national footballers as part of my shelter and that was just mind-boggling for me to see that. And also, I think the drive that these individuals have to move on, that's what gets me to carry on working away at this, because that the little that you can do to help that individual move on is just...
Do you think people... I hate generalisations, but I'm going to generalise. Do you think an awful lot of people look at homeless people and think, you brought it on yourself, it's your fault?
Yes, all the time. And I think even just like a short-term fix, as I was explaining to you before, is just kind of, as you do walk past someone, it's that eye contact, it's that smile. You don't have to give money to everyone, but just acknowledgement that this is an individual, this is a human, is just the first step. And I think nowadays everyone's kind of immune to it and just walks past as like there's nothing wrong, and that's not the society, and that's not the London that I want to live in either.
Or the frustrating thing is everyone cares around Christmas, around winter when it's suddenly cold, but actually people are dying throughout.
We're doing the programme now because it's cold.
You're right. We're not going to do it in the height of summer in
It
July.
really
but
doesn't make much difference, does it?
We found people dying, in the height of summer, in the depths of winter, continually throughout the year.
But it's also worth saying that it's tragic the people on the street and the deaths of people on the street, but it's a small part of the homelessness problem. In London, in temporary accommodation, there's a population the size of Cambridge in London in temporary accommodation.
Which is how many people?
It's around about 135,000 people in Cambridge, so it's roughly equivalent to... So it's incredible to think that all these people in temporary accommodation, who you don't see, you don't walk past, they're the people you're on the train with coming into work.
OK, Louise, we've kept you quiet for a bit. Your turn.
Which is highly unusual. I mean, I would say, that point about, we can do something about it if we want. I mean, that's exactly what my organisation does. It looks for the communities and the organisations that are doing that. Yes, this is a problem, but we can find a solution, and it is happening.
And the Housing First project, which we've mentioned, is it likely to be replicated in a lot of other towns and cities, given the success that you say it's demonstrating?
Yeah, it has a very strong evidence base. So whether you want to go out and visit the cities where they don't have anyone sleeping rough, or you want to speak to academics that are involved in it, or the municipalities that can show that they're saving money by actually doing this. The reality is that there is a lot of evidence out there to show that it is working, and lots of interest from cities who know, and communities that know what they're doing at the moment isn't working for everyone. And as we've heard, it is the tip of the iceberg, but it's the most extreme form, and it is where people are dying throughout.
Those that know British cities, name a few of you said the places where there are no people sleeping rough.
Here, Housing First is still relatively new, so we would need to go to Finland, we would need to go to America, and then we would start to see those changes. Okay, what we're starting to see with our 13 cities is the numbers starting to come down, and elsewhere where Housing First has been in. So in Glasgow, where I explained about an organisation that have been working on it for 10 years, they're able to show the success of their tenancies. So we could look at what would happen if you didn't have Housing First. And then we look at where it's operating, and we say, actually, these people, over 80% of people who formerly people would have said they're not ready for housing, these people have got real issues. Over 80% of them are keeping their tenancies. So they're successful.
You're still working on this. Mm-hmm. You're looking at other areas. What in particular? And do you believe one day you'll be able to say, that's it, it's done, we have ended homelessness? Not we, you in particular. I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, is that it shouldn't always fall to investigative journalist units to have to do some of this research in the data gathering. Louise made the point about knowing the evidence, having the data at your fingertips allows you to make policies that do work. But yeah, certainly issues around the kind of the access to housing, the access to different services when you are in a vulnerable place, when you're on the brink of homelessness, to try and work out what's going wrong in the prevention stages. Because here in the UK we had the Homelessness Reduction Act that was brought in April last year, which does put, in theory, this additional responsibility on councils to prevent people from becoming homeless. Whether that is working, whether there's more that could be done there, is, I think, something to be looked into.
Well, councils aren't approachable, so that's why there's so many day centres out there, because they're the intermediary between the homeless guest and the council, and that shouldn't be the case. They should be able to go directly to the councils, and they should be made more approachable.
I want to ask you about your residents as one of the last things in the programme, but do you believe it is possible, Patrick, to end homelessness?
I think it is, yeah. I think you can end homelessness with the right priorities, the government having the right priorities, not just in terms of housing. It needs bringing a real focus and partnership to address some of the issues we've talked about between different government departments.
So, Saima, your people tonight, you'll go in, I don't know, you'll perhaps go in to see them, but I mean, what will their tomorrow hold for them?
A lot of the time sitting in libraries, sitting on buses to stay out of the cold, possibly going to the day centre to utilise their showers, and and then coming back to another night shelter in the evening.
And it is a cycle of hopelessness, helplessness, or?
No, it's a cycle of hope. The minute they come into that project, that's why I'm there to run my evening as hope and to keep it stable for those individuals so that they can go back in the day and try and help themselves and move themselves on.
How do you keep their spirits up?
Smiles, food, hospitality, and just a community, which is how we do it.
Yeah, and the fact that people are still talking about it, I suppose that's always good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Louise, do you see hope for the future here?
I really do. I think, your panel has kind of shown how many people are interested and how people are helping in lots of different ways, shining a spotlight, actually being there when needed in an emergency situation. I think we have lots to do, but I think people are very interested and people are talking about it, and that's incredibly important.
And people are talking about it. Are the right people listening?
I think so. Well, I think in the 13 European cities that I work with, communities have started to make that difference themselves, and quite often they've been able to get local universities involved, local communities involved. They've also been able to get the local authority involved, and in Glasgow and other places they've been able to get the national government involved.
That's extraordinary. Well, thank you very much indeed. Louise, we appreciate your time very much. May you be bending the right ears in Whitehall and in other cities across Europe and the United Kingdom. Good luck with all of that. I know it's depressing stuff, but it's extraordinary what you managed to find out.
And actually going around the country and hearing about projects like Seima's and day centres, it does give you hope that, look, even if the system is failing, society fills the gaps and steps up.
Yeah, okay.
So.
Listen, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I wish we had a bit more time, but we have given it our all. Thank you for coming in, and thank you very much for watching. I'm David Foster from the Roundtable team. We appreciate your company. Hope you can join us next time. But this has been a two-part special on homelessness, not hopelessness, just homelessness. Bear that in mind. Goodbye for now.